"Sir, can we live with you?" asked the homeless girl to a stranger, not knowing he was a millionaire. What he did will shock you. The sun was setting over New York City when Richard Mitchell crossed the chaotic Fifth Avenue. His impeccable Italian suit and Cartier watch contrasted with the simplicity of the people around him. A successful 45-year-old executive, he ran one of the country's largest technology companies, but something in his gaze revealed an emptiness that no bank account could fill. It was then that his steps were interrupted by a scene that stood out from the usual hustle and bustle. At the side entrance of the Union Square subway station, among street vendors and hurried passers-by, 3 children caught his attention. The youngest, no more than 9 years old, held a sleeping baby in her arms. Beside her, a boy of approximately 12 maintained a defensive posture, like someone who had learned to distrust the world. "Mister, can we live with you?" The question, asked by the girl with a mixture of innocence and desperation, hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't a common request for spare change, it was something much deeper. His eyes met the child's, and at that moment, something within him, something that had long been dormant, awakened. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "Sarah," replied the girl, adjusting the baby in her arms. "This is Michael," she pointed to her older brother, "and the little one is Luke." Richard looked around, searching for an adult responsible for the children, but found no one. The station's movement continued its frantic rhythm, as if that scene didn't exist, as if those 3 lives were invisible to the rest of the world. "Are you hungry?" he asked, receiving a shy nod from Sarah in response. He led the children to a nearby diner, observing how Michael, even starving, first made sure his younger siblings were served. During the meal, the story unfolded. The 3 were siblings who had been separated by the foster care system after an accident involving their parents. Sarah, with a maturity disproportionate to her age, had managed to reunite her brothers. "We don't want to go back to the shelter," Michael finally spoke, breaking his silence. "They wanted to separate us again. Luke almost got hurt because of their lack of care." Richard felt his organized and predictable world crumbling before those 3 pairs of eyes that looked at him with hope. His entire life had been built around goals, numbers, and results. But there, in that simple diner, he faced a decision that no MBA could have prepared him for. "Where are you sleeping?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "In a shelter near here," Sarah answered, "but they only let us stay one night. Tomorrow we have to leave early." The executive took out his phone and made some calls, first to his trusted lawyer, then to the superintendent of his building. Next, he looked at the children with a determination that surprised even himself. "Do you trust me?" he asked, receiving 3 confused looks in response. "I can help you, but we need to do this the right way. Nobody is going to separate you, I promise." That night, for the first time in a long time, Richard's penthouse apartment in the Upper East Side came to life. A mattress was improvised in the living room, clean towels were set aside, and new clothes were hastily purchased at a 24-hour store. The first days were a real test for everyone. Richard, accustomed to his solitary routine, now needed to coordinate bath times, meals, and bedtime. Sarah continued with her maternal instinct, always attentive to Luke's needs. Michael gradually began to lower his guard, especially after Richard set up a small study space for him. Richard's attorney, Barbara Simpson, worked tirelessly to regularize the situation. The initial investigations confirmed the children's story. The shelters where they had been really had serious problems with negligence. The case of Luke's near accident was documented, but had been covered up by the institution. "Richard, do you understand the complexity of this situation?" Barbara asked during a meeting at her office. "You're a single man with no experience with children, wanting custody of 3 minors. The judge will question your motives." "Let him question," he responded with a conviction that surprised even his lawyer. "You've seen the shelter reports, you've met the children. They need stability, a home." In the apartment, the transformation was visible. Richard's minimalist office gained colorful drawings on the walls. The refrigerator, previously almost empty, was now full of food. The silence was replaced by laughter, occasional crying, and childish conversations. But not everything was rosy. A social worker, assigned to monitor the case, began making frequent visits. Diane Oliver was known for her rigor and skepticism regarding unconventional adoptions. Her questions were incisive, her observations meticulous. "Mr. Mitchell, don't you think you're being impulsive?" she questioned during one of her visits. "3 children are an enormous responsibility. Your professional life will certainly be affected." Richard looked out the window of his apartment, observing Sarah playing with Luke on the balcony, while Michael did his homework. "You know, Miss Oliver, before them, I had a perfectly organized life, controlled schedule, precise appointments, everything in order. But now I understand that I was merely existing, not living." The social worker made a few more notes on her clipboard, her face maintaining its usual neutral expression. But something in Richard's sincerity made her hesitate before making her next comment. "Still, we need to consider the best interest of the children. There are families registered in the adoption system for years, traditional families with experience in raising children." It was at that moment that Sarah entered the room, carrying a drawing she had just made. It was a simple representation, 5 people holding hands, one of them wearing what appeared to be a suit. "Look, Uncle Richard, I drew our family," exclaimed the girl, proud of her work. Diane observed the scene carefully, noticing how the executive's eyes filled with tears upon receiving that colored piece of paper. She also couldn't help but notice how Michael, from across the room, smiled discreetly upon hearing the word family. The news spread like wildfire through the company corridors. Richard Mitchell, the CEO, known for his iron discipline and calculated decisions, was trying to adopt 3 children at once. The whispers in the hallways alternated between admiration and criticism, especially when he began leaving early to attend school meetings or take Luke to the pediatrician. "You're risking everything you've built," warned Frank, his majority partner, during a tense board meeting. "The shareholders are concerned about your commitment to the company. 3 children at once, Richard. That's insanity." Richard adjusted his tie, a habit he had maintained since his first days as an intern. "Frank, for the past 15 years, I've dedicated my life to this company. I've sacrificed relationships, weekends, holidays. Now, for the first time, I've found something that makes me question whether professional success is enough for a fulfilling life." The discussion was interrupted by an urgent call. Luke had a high fever at school. Without hesitation, Richard left the meeting halfway through, ignoring the disapproving looks. On the way to the school, he received a message from Barbara. The judge responsible for the case had scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following week. At the school, he found Sarah sitting next to her little brother in the nurse's office, singing softly to calm him. Michael was standing near the door, his tense posture betraying his concern. The scene deeply touched Richard. These children had built their own protection system, caring for each other when no one else did. "Sorry to pull you from your meeting, Uncle," Michael murmured as they headed to the hospital. "Never apologize for needing help," Richard replied, holding the boy's hand firmly. "You are my priority now." At the hospital, while waiting for Luke's tests, Sarah fell asleep in Richard's lap. It was then that he noticed a small scar on her hand, a mark she tried to hide. "It was at the last shelter," Michael explained quietly, noticing Richard's gaze. Sarah tried to prevent them from taking Luke to another institution. She held onto the bars of his bed so tightly that she got hurt when the staff pulled her away. Richard felt his heart tighten. How had these children endured so much? Determination to protect them grew even stronger within him. Days later, during a conversation with Diane, the social worker revealed something disturbing. "We found records of a possible relative of the children, an aunt who lives abroad and has expressed interest in taking Luke." "Only Luke?" Richard questioned, feeling a chill down his spine. "Yes, she made it clear that she only has the means to care for the youngest." The news hit Richard like a blow. After all he had discovered about the bond between the siblings, the idea of Separating them seemed too cruel. That night, watching the children sleep, Sarah and Luke sharing one room, Michael in the other, he made a silent promise. He would fight with all his strength to keep them together. What Richard didn't know was that his determination would be tested in ways he never imagined. The system, with its impersonal bureaucracy, still held more surprises, and powerful people were beginning to take an interest in the case of the executive who defied conventions. The preliminary hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning. Richard had spent the night reviewing documents with Barbara and preparing for all possible questions. The children stayed with Helen, his trusted secretary, who had grown fond of them in recent weeks. Judge Anthony Morrison had a reputation for being inflexible in adoption cases. His austere face and thin-rimmed glasses contributed to his intimidating appearance. The courtroom, with its beige walls and antique furniture, seemed to suck all optimism from the environment. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge began, flipping through a thick folder, "are you aware of the precedent you're trying to set? A single man with no previous experience with children, wanting to adopt 3 minors at once." Richard stood firm. "Your Honor, I'm not trying to set any precedent. I'm simply responding to the request of 3 children who need a home and, above all, need to stay together." It was then that an elegant woman entered the room, accompanied by another lawyer. Diane, the social worker, frowned upon recognizing her. It was Victoria Adams, the aunt, who had expressed interest in Luke. "Pardon the delay, Your Honor," said the lawyer accompanying her. "My client came directly from the airport. She resides in London and came especially for this hearing." The judge nodded, allowing them to be seated. Richard felt his stomach turn when he noticed Victoria's calculating look. "Ms. Adams," the judge began, "do you confirm your interest in taking custody?" "Of Luke?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied with a slightly French accent. "As the sister of the children's deceased mother, I feel it's my duty to give little Luke a dignified life. I can offer him international education, comfort, opportunities." "And what about the others?" interrupted Richard, unable to contain himself. Victoria looked at him coldly. "Unfortunately, I don't have the means to care for all 3. Besides, Sarah and Michael are already older. They have their own complexities." Barbara stood up, holding a folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present some documents. First, psychological reports attesting to the strong bond between the siblings. Second, records from the period they were separated in different institutions, demonstrating the negative impact of that separation on their emotional development." The judge adjusted his glasses, examining the papers carefully. Diane, who had remained silent until then, asked permission to speak. "Your Honor, as the social worker responsible for the case, I need to note that, in my observations, the children have developed a healthy family dynamic in Mr. Mitchell's company. Separating them now, especially considering their history of trauma, could cause irreparable damage." Victoria leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something. The man cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Honor, my client would like to propose an arrangement. She is willing to allow regular visits between the siblings, with all travel expenses paid by her." Richard felt his blood boil. How could someone talk about 3 children as if they were commodities to be negotiated? It was then that his phone vibrated, a message from Helen with a photo of the children. In the image, Sarah was helping Luke build a block castle, while Michael read an architecture book, a gift Richard had given him the previous week. Victoria's presence brought more than concern to the already complicated custody process. In the days following the hearing, she began making surprise visits to the children's school, always trying to specifically approach Luke. Sarah, with her intuition sharpened by a difficult life, perceived the aunt's intentions and wouldn't leave her younger brother's side. On a particularly tense afternoon, Richard received a call from the school coordinator. Victoria had appeared again, this time with expensive gifts for Luke. Michael, noticing the commotion in the yard, abandoned his math class and ran to protect his siblings. "Mr. Mitchell," explained the coordinator, "I understand the delicacy of the situation, but we need to maintain order at the school. Michael can't simply leave the classroom like that." Richard took a deep breath before responding. "Mrs. Martha, that boy spent years protecting his siblings when no one else did. We can't expect him to simply switch off that instinct. While driving to the school, he received a message from Barbara. She had discovered something intriguing about Victoria. The children's aunt wasn't as well established in London as she claimed. In fact, there were records of considerable debts and a history of fraud cases. At the school, he found Sarah hugging Luke, while Michael maintained his usual protective posture. Victoria was still there, her impeccably made-up face, not completely hiding her irritation. "They're wild," she declared upon seeing Richard approach. "They refused my gifts, were rude. It's obvious they need proper education." "They're not wild," Richard replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. "They're children who have learned to trust their survival instinct, and that instinct is telling them exactly who you are." That night, after the children were asleep, Richard received an unexpected visit. Diane, the social worker who had initially been so skeptical, appeared at his apartment with a concerned expression. "We discovered something you need to know," she said, sitting on the couch. "We did a deeper investigation into the accident that killed the children's parents. There are inconsistencies in the report." Richard served coffee to Diane, noticing how her hands trembled slightly as she held the documents she brought. "The children's mother," continued Diane, "had taken out a substantial life insurance policy a few months before the accident. The only problem is that, due to a specific clause, the beneficiary could only receive the amount if they had custody of at least one of the children." The pieces began to fit together in Richard's mind. Victoria's sudden interest, her insistence on taking only Luke, the youngest and theoretically the easiest to control. "There's more," Diane hesitated before continuing. "We found old medical records of the children's mother. She had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations, always after conflicts with her sister, Victoria. The reports suggest a pattern of manipulation and psychological abuse." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. In the room next door, he could hear Luke's soft breathing during sleep. In the other room, Sarah was probably clutching her favorite, teddy bear, while Michael, as always, took time to fall asleep, reading his architecture books. The revelation about the family's past brought a new urgency to the process. Richard and his legal team worked tirelessly to protect the children. But Victoria also had her resources. She began a subtle but effective media campaign, painting herself as a loving aunt who only wanted the best for her youngest nephew. Amidst all this turbulence, something unexpected happened. During a Saturday afternoon, while Richard was helping Michael with a science project, Sarah appeared with an old box she had found at the back of the closet in their room. "Uncle Richard, look what we found," exclaimed the girl, emptying the contents onto the living room table. They were old photos, postcards, and letters. In one of the photos, a young, smiling woman hugged 3 small children. On the back, a date from 5 years ago, and a message: "Even if the whole world doubts, I know you are my greatest strength. With love, Mum." Michael, who rarely showed emotion, had to look away upon seeing the photo. Sarah hugged her brother, while Luke, even without fully understanding, joined the hug. Richard was observing the scene when he noticed something peculiar in one of the letters. It was correspondence between the children's mother and a doctor, dated a few weeks before the accident. In the document, she expressed concern about the growing pressure she had been experiencing from her sister and asked for guidance on how to protect her children. "Diane needs to see this," murmured Richard, carefully photographing each document with his cell phone. That same night, while the children slept, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Frank, his partner, who had remained distant since the tense board meeting. "Richard, I need to tell you something." Frank's voice sounded tense. "Victoria was here at the company today. She tried to convince me to pressure you to give up custody of the children. She offered a significant business partnership with European companies in exchange." Richard felt his stomach turn. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her she was in the wrong place. And also," Frank paused, "I apologized for having doubted you. Seeing someone try to use business to manipulate children's fate, it opened my eyes." The conversation was interrupted by a noise coming from the children's room. Richard found Sarah consoling Luke, who had awakened from a nightmare. The girl was singing softly the same song that her mother used to sing, a lullaby about stars and protection. "Uncle," Sarah called when Richard approached. We don't have to leave, right? Aunt Victoria won't take Luke, will she? Richard sat on the edge of the bed, pulling all three close to him. Nobody is going to separate you, I promise. Tomorrow we'll talk to Barbara and show her what you found today. Those photos and letters might be very important. The discoveries of the old letters and photos caused a turning point in the process. Barbara, after thoroughly examining the documents, managed to locate the doctor mentioned in the correspondence. Dr. Paul Silver, now retired, still kept detailed records of his consultations. The children's mother wasn't paranoid, explained the doctor during a meeting at his private office. She had concrete reasons to fear her sister. Victoria always demonstrated controlling and manipulative behavior, especially after Luke's birth. Richard listened attentively while Diane took notes. The office, with its walls full of diplomas yellowed by time, seemed to hold secrets that were finally coming to light. She came to see me several times, continued Dr. Paul, adjusting his old glasses. She was especially concerned about her sister's insistence on having access to the children. Victoria had tried on various occasions to convince her to let Luke live with her in Europe. It was at that moment that Helen, Richard's secretary, called in panic. Victoria had appeared at the apartment, accompanied by a court officer and her lawyer, claiming to have obtained a temporary visitation order for Luke. Sarah won't let anyone near her brother, explained Helen, her voice trembling. Michael is at the bedroom door and not even the officer can make him move aside. Richard rose immediately, his heart racing. I'm coming home now. Diane, can you come with me? Doctor, we'll need your official testimony. During the journey, which seemed to last an eternity, Richard received several messages. Frank had activated the company's legal team, who were already on their way to the apartment. Barbara had made direct contact with Judge Morrison, questioning the validity of the court order. When they arrived, they found a scene of tension. Sarah was hugging Luke in the corner of the room, while Michael remained firm at the door, his eyes revealing a mixture of fear and determination. Victoria, impeccably dressed as always, maintained an artificial smile on her face. This is ridiculous, she declared upon seeing Richard. I have a court order. These children are out of control, proving exactly what I said about the lack of proper discipline. It was then that Diane stepped forward, her professional posture masking her indignation. Ms. Adams, as the social worker responsible for this case, I must inform you that any attempt at forcibly removing the child will be registered as psychological trauma in my official report. The court officer, who was observing the situation, with visible discomfort, consulted his documents again. Ma'am, the order only provides for supervised visits, not removal of the child. Victoria momentarily lost her composure. You don't understand. I have the right. That money. That child. She stopped abruptly, realizing her slip. Richard and Diane exchanged significant looks, while Barbara, who had just arrived, made sure to record every word on her cell phone. In the room, Sarah continued singing softly to Luke, the same lullaby that her mother used to sing. Michael, still at the door, relaxed a bit upon seeing Richard, but maintained his protective position. Victoria's slip opened the doors to a deeper investigation. Barbara, working together with Diane and a team specialized in fraud, began to unravel a complex web of financial manipulations. The life insurance of the children's mother, explained the lawyer during an urgent meeting, was altered under suspicious circumstances. The signature on the beneficiary change document shows inconsistencies. While the adults dealt with legal issues, life in Richard's apartment continued to transform. Michael, inspired by the architecture books he had received, began making drawings of what he called our future house. In his improvised plans, each family member had their special space. Look, Uncle Richard, he explained one night, spreading his drawings on the dining table. This is Sarah's reading corner, because she likes to read stories to Luke. And this space here is the garden where we can plant flowers, like Mom used to do. Sarah, who was setting the table for dinner with special care, smiled upon seeing her brother's drawings. Luke, sitting in his high chair, clapped excitedly, even without fully understanding what was happening. It was during one of these domestic moments that Richard received a call that would change everything. It was a nurse from a psychiatric hospital in a small town upstate. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice filled with urgency, "we need your presence here. We have a patient. She was in a coma for a long time without documents. Recently, she began showing signs of recovery and won't stop saying the children's names." Richard felt his heart stop for a moment. What is her name?" She identified herself as Claire Sanders, replied the nurse. "She says she's the mother of 3 children, Sarah, Michael, and Luke." The phone almost fell from his hands. Claire Sanders, the children's mother, whom everyone believed had died in the accident, was alive. The implications of this discovery were enormous, not only for the custody process, but mainly for the hearts of those 3 children who had learned to build a new life. That night, after the children were asleep, Richard sat on his balcony, observing the city lights. The possibility of losing those he had learned to love as his own children was terrifying, but at the same time, how could he deny these children the right to reunite with their mother? Diane, who had stayed to discuss the next steps, joined him on the balcony. "You know this changes everything, don't you?" Richard nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Yes, but if she really is alive, if it really is her, maybe this explains why Victoria was so desperate to get custody of Luke before the truth came to light." The journey to the psychiatric hospital was marked by heavy silence. Richard opted not to tell the children about the possibility of their mother being alive until he had absolute certainty. Diane and Barbara accompanied him, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of this discovery. The hospital, an old building amidst a well-kept garden, had an air of serenity that contrasted with the emotional storm they all felt. Dr. Meredith Parker, the physician responsible for the case, received them in her office. "Claire arrived here approximately 2 years ago," explained the doctor, consulting an extensive medical record. "She was brought in serious condition after being found by the side of a road. She had no documents, and the trauma had severely affected her memory." Richard observed the photos attached to the record. The bruised and unrecognizable face of the first days gradually gave way to familiar features, until transforming into the woman he had seen smiling in the old photos with the children. "In recent weeks," continued Dr. Meredith, "she began having increasingly frequent flashbacks. The children's names were the first thing she could remember clearly. Then came memories about her sister, Victoria." Diane, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. "And what does she say about her sister?" The doctor hesitated for a moment. "She has very intense reactions when she talks about Victoria. According to her accounts, on the night of the accident, she was fleeing from her sister, who had threatened to take the children away from her." It was at that moment that a nurse entered the room. "Dr. Parker, the patient is asking about the visitor. She says she smelled the cologne her husband used." Richard frowned, confused. The nurse smiled gently. "Not you, sir. She refers to the scent in the air, jasmine. She said her husband always wore that fragrance." Barbara quickly consulted her notes. The children's father really did have that preference. It's documented in the personal belongings that were catalogued after the accident. Following the nurse down a corridor illuminated by natural light that entered through large windows, the group reached a garden area. Sitting on a bench, a woman of approximately 35 was observing a small flower bed. Her brown hair, slightly graying, framed a face that carried the marks of time and suffering, but still maintained traces of the beauty seen in the old photographs. Upon seeing Richard, she smiled serenely. "You must be the one taking care of my children. Does Sarah still sing to make Luke sleep?" The question, asked so naturally, caught Richard by surprise. "Yes," he answered, feeling his voice fail. "Every night." Claire nodded, her eyes watering. "And Michael, does he still draw houses on every paper he finds?" "Now he has his own notebooks for that," Richard replied, sitting beside her. "He wants to be an architect." For a moment, only the sound of wind in the trees filled the environment. Claire then took something from the pocket of her robe, a small paper folded several times. The paper that Claire held was an old news article, already yellowed by time. It showed a photo of Richard with the children, taken during a charity event that his company had organized months ago. In the image, Sarah smiled openly. Michael had a discreet smile on his face, and Luke in Richard's lap played with his tie. "One of the nurses showed me this article when I started talking about my children," explained Claire, her voice soft but firm. It was as if a puzzle began to form in my mind. I saw how happy they are, how they found a new home. Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Claire, they never stopped loving you. Sarah keeps all the photos she found. Michael still draws you in the family portraits, and Luke, well, he's too young to remember, but they always talk about you to him." Claire wiped away a tear that ran down her face. "You know, when I started to recover my memories, my biggest fear was discovering that they had been separated. Victoria, she always wanted Luke. Not out of love, but for the insurance money. She forged my signature, altered documents. On the night of the accident, I was fleeing with the children because she had threatened me." Diane, who was observing the scene with professional but emotional eyes, approached. "Ms. Claire, we need to record all of this. Your testimony can not only ensure the safety of the children, but also bring your sister to justice." "I know," replied Claire, her voice gaining strength. "But first, I need to ask something of Richard." She turned to him, her eyes revealing a mixture of gratitude and plea. "You gave my children something I always wanted for them. A safe home, love, stability. I don't want to take that away from them." Richard began to protest, but Claire gently interrupted him. "Let me finish. I'm not in a condition to take care of them by myself now. I need time to recover completely, to re-establish myself. What I want to propose is something different." Dr. Meredith, who had remained silent until then, approached. "Claire has made notable progress in her recovery, but she still needs regular follow-up. The trauma she suffered left marks that need time to heal." "What I want," continued Claire, holding Richard's hand, "is for us to continue being a family. You're not just the man who saved my children. You've become part of them. If you accept, we can build something new, something that allows the children to have both the love of their mother and the father they chose." Claire's words hung in the air like a promise of hope. Richard looked at Diane and Barbara, who exchanged significant glances. The moment to tell the children about Claire came sooner than Richard expected. On a Sunday afternoon, he gathered the three in the living room, his heart beating fast as he searched for the right words. "Remember those photos? Of Mom that you found," he began, sitting on the floor with them. Sarah immediately grabbed Luke's hand, while Michael straightened his posture, as he always did when he was apprehensive. "Something very special has happened," continued Richard, his voice soft. "Your mother, she's alive." The silence that followed was deafening. It was Sarah who first reacted, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. "Uncle Richard, are you sure? It's not a joke?" "I'm sure, sweetheart. I saw her in person. She's recovering in a hospital, but she's well and misses you terribly." Michael, who rarely showed strong emotions, couldn't contain his tears. Luke, even without fully understanding the situation, sensed the emotion-charged atmosphere and hugged his sister. But Sarah hesitated, her voice trembling. "Do we have to leave here?" Richard pulled all three into a tight hug. "No, my loves, your mother and I talked a lot about this. She wants us to continue being a family all together. She understands that this is your home now, too." It was then that the doorbell rang. Diane was in the hallway, accompanied by Claire. The medical team had authorized her first visit to her children, as long as supervised by the social worker. The moment when the children saw their mother was one of indescribable emotion. Sarah let out a cry of joy and ran into Claire's arms. Michael, always more reserved, approached slowly, as if fearing she might disappear. Luke, in Richard's arms, looked curiously at the lady everyone seemed to know. "My treasures," Claire whispered, hugging Sarah and Michael. "How you've grown, Sarah. You're so beautiful. Michael, look at you, so tall." Luke, still in Richard's arms, began to fidget, extending his little arms toward Claire. It was as if something in his small heart recognized that voice, that smell, that love which, even distant, had never ceased to exist. "Hi, my little one," Claire said softly, taking Luke in her arms. The boy immediately snuggled against her, as if that were his natural place in the world. Richard observed the scene with mixed emotions. Seeing the pure love between mother and children made him certain they had made the right decision. It wouldn't be an easy path. There was much to be adjusted, much to be healed, but it was the path of love, of understanding, of the family they chose to be. 6 months passed since the reunion. Claire, after completing her treatment, moved into an apartment in the same building as Richard, just 2 floors below. The adaptation was gradual, respecting the time and needs of each one, especially the children. The case against Victoria followed its course in the justice system. The evidence gathered, the letters found by the children, the medical testimonies, the forged insurance documents, was irrefutable. She ended up confessing her actions and was required to return all the money she had improperly received. On a particularly special Saturday morning, the entire family gathered at the courthouse. Richard, with Claire's support and consent, would officially adopt the children. Not to replace the mother, but to legitimize the bonds of love that already existed. "Now I officially have 2 rooms," celebrated Luke, who alternated nights between his mother's apartment and Richard's, always accompanied by his siblings when he wanted. Michael, who had begun taking architectural drawing classes on Saturdays, showed his newest project, a house that combined elements from both apartments, with special spaces for each family member. "One day I'll build a house like this for us," he promised, proud. Sarah, who had inherited her mother's musical talent, now took singing lessons. Her lullabies for Luke gained new melodies, mixing the old ones she had learned from Claire with her own compositions. Judge Morrison, who had followed the entire process from the beginning, made a point of presiding over the adoption ceremony. "In 20 years on the bench," he said, "I've never seen a case that demonstrated so clearly that family is much more than blood ties." Diane, who had become a close friend of the family, used the experience from this case to propose changes in the foster care system. Together with Barbara and Richard, she created a foundation that offered legal and psychological support to families in similar situations. Richard's company also transformed. He implemented policies to support employees who decided to adopt, created a daycare at the workplace, and established flexible hours for parents. Frank, his partner, became one of the biggest enthusiasts of these changes. Claire found her calling helping other people who had gone through trauma. Her testimony and story of overcoming inspired many not to give up, to believe that there is always hope. On a tranquil afternoon, while everyone was gathered in the building's garden, Claire watering the flowers she had planted with Sarah, Michael showing his drawings to Richard, and Luke running between them with his inexhaustible energy, a lady who was walking her dog stopped to observe them. "What a beautiful family," she commented. "Are you all related?" Richard and Claire exchanged a knowing smile before answering in unison, "Yes, we're a family that love built."